introduce our speaker. Reverend David has been attending the Center of Enlightenment for as long as I have. He was ordained on October 15th, 2017, so this month was an anniversary. He is currently serving as our president of the board of directors and getting ready for another term starting next year. He is also chairperson of the membership committee and a member of the public relations committee. Reverend David was certified as a Reiki master in 1999, as a spiritual healer in 2000, and as a medium in 2016. On a side note, he has had a challenging couple of years, but I'm glad he's here, and I know I call him friend, as do a lot of you. If you're ever in need, we all know he is there. So please help me welcome Reverend David to the podium.
Thank you, Lisa.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Sadly, a couple of our congregants have transitioned to spirit in the last few weeks. I ask you all to please close your eyes and send love to the families of Gregory Hellenberg and Aloma Merja. I was originally planning on talking about the Day of the Dead, because it's tomorrow, and Spirit said, oh, you're going to talk about more specific things about death. You're going to talk about grief. And when someone passes, we feel a sense of loss, and we grieve. So when I was a newly sober, recovering alcoholic 30-some years ago, I realized that both of my grandmothers were old enough that their deaths could happen at any time. One was 83 and one was 95. Also, my father had just had quadruple bypass surgery, and while it was successful, you never know. So I came up with the concept of pre-grieving. This is where you send prayers into the future for your loved one, yourself, and your family, so that the transition will be as peaceful and loving as possible. You also feel the loss that will happen when they were gone, so you can empty some of that bucket before it happens. I worked on this for a few months, and then another recovery topic presented itself, so I moved on. The next year, when my dad's mom passed, I don't think my pre-grieving worked as well as I had hoped. She died on a Sunday night, so the funeral was set for the following Friday. I kept working that week, and on Tuesday when I got paid, I drove to the credit union and deposited my check. Leaving the credit union, I suddenly burst into tears and drove my car through one of those islands that they use to control traffic in the parking lot. I messed up the suspension on my front right wheel pretty bad and got to deal with that issue before the funeral. In that instance, my pre-grieving didn't work so well. Years later, when my other grandmother and my father passed, I was better prepared and was able to support my siblings through their sudden and immediate grief because I had already dealt with some of my own feelings months and years earlier. Since very little is actually new or an original thought, years later I read about anticipatory grief, defined by medicine.net as the normal mourning that occurs when a patient or family is expecting a death. First identified as a real phenomenon by Eric Lindemann in 1944. Lindemann was a German-American author and psychiatrist specializing in bereavement. He worked at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston as the chief of psychiatry and is noted for his extensive study on effects of traumatic events on survivors and families after the Coconut Grove nightclub fire in 1942. There's an article online called Anticipatory Grief, Grieving a Loss Before It Happens by Karen Roldan. She defines anticipatory grief as when you experience deep sorrow over you losing your loved one before they have died. She writes, the difference between normal grief and anticipatory grief are a matter of timing and complexity. For timing, anticipatory grief happens before the loss occurs, while typical grief is after the loss. As for complexity, anticipatory grief adds the layer of grief over your loved one's suffering during their decline and impending death. In contrast, normal grief, or just grief, is the array of emotions you go through after a death has already taken place. This is grief that you work through without any additional problems holding you back in the grieving process. I have to disagree with that last sentence because when somebody passes, there's a lot of work to deal with in the next few days and weeks and months and even years. Back to her writing. You know the death is coming and you are grieving for what has been and what will never be. At the same time, you are conflicted because you want to put the best face on for your loved one's sake and you want to enjoy the remaining time you have together. I really want to reiterate that. You want to be there to support them and be positive, and you want to enjoy the remaining time you have together, but at the same time, you have these feelings of impending loss and grief. 3 different emotions all at the same time. No wonder people, break down in other situations. Family members are not the only ones to suffer from anticipatory grief. Caregivers, hospice nurses, assisted living employees, doctors, and more can go through this grieving period as well. Now, I think this article is a great resource for the concept of anticipatory grieving, and I encourage you all to read it. To that end, later today, I'll post a link to the article on the church's Facebook page. Now, at this point in discussing grieving, I have to mention Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, a Swiss-American psychiatrist who was a pioneer in near-death studies and author of the internationally best-selling book On Death and Dying, where she first discussed her theory of the 5 stages of grief, also known as the Kubler-Ross method. I'm sure many of you have heard of this. Here's what the 5 stages of grieving are, and you can consider and process them in which order you experience them. And you experience them repeatedly for weeks, months, or years. Denial. It didn't happen. Anger. I'm mad about what happened. Bargaining. Maybe I could negotiate my way out of these feelings. Depression. I am stuck in my sadness and may never feel different forever. Acceptance. I will love them forever and I will live my life. Now, I've heard in several sermons and lectures over the years that there's a 6th stage of grief. Chocolate. Chocolate heals many things. It helps in dabda. And so it's dabdaka, in my opinion. That's a legitimate thing, too. They've studied that science does, chocolate does fit into the science of grief and helps smooth some of the passages. Another view on grieving is a new book entitled I Keep Trying to Catch His Eye by Ivan Maisel, a sports writer who formerly worked at ESPN and Sports Illustrated. It was just released to stores on October 26, 2001. I heard Ivan talking about it on a podcast, and something he said caught my ear. We each grieve in our own way, and each person's grief is right for them. Ivan wrote the book because in February 2015, he received a call that would alter his life forever. His son Max's car was found abandoned in a parking lot next to Lake Ontario. 2 months later, Max's body would be found in the lake. I Keep Trying to Catch His Eye is a story of Ivan's love for a son who was so different from him, but who he loved so deeply, and how he came to learn that grief for Max was nothing more than a last, ultimate expression of love. A reviewer wrote, by humanizing Max and humanizing his grief, Maisel evokes understanding instead of sorrow, appreciation instead of anxiety, and love instead of fear. One of the reasons he wrote this book was because his reaction was processing his feelings and being comfortable with the fact that he'd never had the relationship with his son that he wanted. His wife, on the other hand, did everything to investigate. How did it happen? Why did it happen? Why did her son make this choice? She was like a forensic investigator. As he said in this podcast, both are legitimate forms of grieving because everybody's entitled to their own reaction. Now I need to go back to Ivan's statement that we each grieve in our own way and each person's grief is right for them. I have a friend whose husband passed away unexpectedly. He was a picture of health, and he had just been given a thorough physical for insurance reasons. The next month, he's running a marathon, has a massive heart attack, and drops dead on the course. Just like that, seconds. My friend was a volunteer working at the finish line, and when she heard the words, "Man down," come over the walkie-talkies, she immediately began sprinting up the course into the stream of marathoners because she knew it was her husband. They had that kind of soul relationship. The first year after his passing, she didn't leave the house. All of her friends supported her in whatever way we could. People bought her groceries, people cooked her meals, people cleaned her house, and did her laundry. I was good at the grocery part. The rest of that, not so much. She slowly started to pick up the pieces of her life by doing these seemingly simple things that we all take for granted. The second year after his passing, she did start to leave the house, but mostly for grief counseling appointments and support group meetings. Finally, during the third year, she started to visit friends and create her new reality. Now, other people that I know have gone on without even having a memorial service for their spouse or loved one. They go right back to work and act like nothing has happened. The ashes from the cremation sit there on the shelf, probably until they pass, and then somebody else gets to deal with it. Both examples are part of the grieving process, and both are valid. The important thing is to respect each person's choices about their own grieving. Me personally, I could never imagine not having a funeral or memorial service and getting together and crying with my loved ones. That's just me. These other people I know that went on as if nothing happened, that's what's right for them. Now, getting back to anticipatory grieving, I want to talk about the first song that Lisa played. Warren Zevon wrote "Keep Me in Your Heart" shortly after he was given a terminal cancer diagnosis in the fall of 2002. He said in an interview, "I don't think anybody knows quite what to do when they get the diagnosis. I picked up the guitar and found myself writing this kind of farewell. Instantly, I realized I'd found what to do with myself. On reflection, it might be a little bit of a woe is me song, but it made me realize what I was going to do with the rest of my life. It may be the last song on the album, but it was the first song I wrote." That album, The Wind, is the 12th and final studio album by Zevon. The album was released on August 20th, 2003, which was 2 weeks before his death on September 7th, 2003. To me, when Warren Zevon wrote, "Keep me in your heart," he did the best anticipatory grieving that I know. Because as it said, the patients and their loved ones are pre-grieving. Thank you, Mr. Zevon, for that message. And Aloma and Gregory, I'm keeping you right here. Thank you for your time, and thank you for your attention.